What if everything you believed about pain was wrong? What if the very suffering you spend your life trying to avoid is actually the key to wisdom? Or what if that's just a dangerous lie we tell ourselves to make sense of senseless agony? Tonight, in a quiet corner of Vienna, two of history's most profound thinkers sit across from each other, steam rising from their cups of tea. The year is 1965, and Viktor Frankl has just returned from a lecture at the university. His weathered hands, marked by years in Nazi concentration camps, wrap around the warm ceramic. Across from him sits a figure that seems to shimmer between worlds, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, whose eyes hold the depth of 25 centuries of contemplation. The setting is intimate, almost mundane, a small cafe that stays open late for intellectuals and insomniacs. The walls are lined with books in multiple languages, their spines creating a tapestry of human knowledge. Outside, Vienna sleeps, but inside, two minds prepare to wrestle with perhaps the most fundamental question of human existence. Frankl adjusts his glasses and looks across at his companion. There's something both ordinary and extraordinary about this moment. Here sits a man who survived the unimaginable horrors of Auschwitz and Dachau, who emerged not broken but transformed, carrying insights about meaning that would revolutionize psychology. And across from him, the figure whose teachings about suffering and liberation have guided millions for over 2 millennia. You know, Frankl begins, his Austrian accent coloring the English they've agreed to speak, I've spent my entire career trying to help people find meaning in their suffering. But sometimes I wonder if we've got it backwards. Sometimes I think we should be working harder to eliminate suffering altogether. The Buddha's expression remains serene, but there's a subtle shift in his posture, a slight leaning forward that suggests deep interest. His voice, when it comes, carries the weight of ages. Ah, my friend, but what if suffering itself is the teacher we've been looking for all along? What if trying to eliminate it is like trying to eliminate gravity, not only impossible, but missing the point entirely? The air between them seems to thicken with possibility. This isn't going to be an academic discussion filled with footnotes and references. This is going to be raw, honest, two human beings who've looked into the abyss of human suffering and come back with radically different maps for the rest of us. Frankl takes a sip of his tea, his mind already racing. But that's exactly what troubles me about your approach. When I was in the camps, I saw people who accepted their suffering as some kind of cosmic necessity, and they died. They gave up. The ones who survived were the ones who said, this is wrong, this should not be, and I will find a way to transcend it, not by accepting it, but by creating meaning despite it. The Buddha's smile is gentle, but unwavering. And yet, Victor, did those who survived not first have to accept the reality of where they were? Did they not have to stop fighting against what was, before they could find the strength to change what could be? This is the crux of it, the fault line that runs through human philosophy and psychology. On one side, the ancient wisdom that sees suffering as an inevitable part of existence, something to be understood and transcended through acceptance and insight. On the other, the modern therapeutic approach that views unnecessary suffering as a problem to be solved, a condition to be treated, a wrong to be righted. The cafe seems to hold its breath. Even the barista, cleaning glasses behind the counter, moves more quietly, as if sensing that something profound is unfolding at the corner table. Frankl leans back in his chair, his fingers drumming thoughtfully on the table. You're asking me to believe that a mother watching her child die of a preventable disease should find wisdom in that suffering rather than rage against the systems that allowed it to happen. No, the Buddha replies, his voice steady but warm. I'm asking you to consider that the mother's suffering and her rage can coexist with wisdom. That understanding the nature of suffering doesn't mean accepting injustice. It means seeing clearly enough to act effectively. The debate is joined now, these two titans of human understanding locked in a discussion that cuts to the heart of how we should live, how we should respond to pain, and what it means to be fully human. One carries the wisdom of ancient contemplation, the other the hard-won insights of modern survival and healing. Outside, Vienna continues its slow rotation toward dawn, but inside this cafe, time seems suspended. Two worldviews are about to collide, and from that collision might emerge something new, something that could change how we think about the deepest challenges of human existence. The question hangs in the air between them, as old as consciousness itself and as urgent as this moment. Is suffering something to transcend through acceptance and understanding, or something to overcome through meaning-making and action? The answer might determine not just how we live, but who we become in the living. The Buddha sets down his cup with deliberate care, the small sound marking a transition into deeper waters. His eyes, ancient yet present, fix on Frankl with the intensity of someone who has seen the full spectrum of human experience. Victor, let me tell you what I discovered under the Bodhi tree, what took me years of the most intense suffering to understand. I was born a prince, sheltered from all pain, all sickness, all death. And that shelter was itself a kind of suffering, the suffering of ignorance. Frankl nods, recognizing the parallels to his own journey from comfortable academic to concentration camp prisoner. Yes, I understand that awakening. I too lived in a world of theoretical knowledge before the camps taught me what suffering really meant. But here's where our paths diverge. The Buddha continues, his voice taking on the rhythm of someone who has told this story countless times, yet never lost its urgency. When I first encountered old age, sickness, and death, my reaction was exactly what yours might be. Horror, rejection, a desperate search for escape. I tried everything. Extreme asceticism, starving myself nearly to death. Sensual indulgence, thinking pleasure could overcome pain. Neither worked. The cafe's atmosphere seems to deepen around them, as if the very air is becoming more contemplative. Frankl listens intently, his psychologist's mind analyzing not just the words, but the emotional undertones. The breakthrough came when I stopped trying to escape suffering and started trying to understand it. Not intellectually, any philosopher can do that, but intimately, personally. I sat with it. I watched how it arose in my mind, how it twisted my thoughts, how it created more suffering through my resistance to it. Frankl's fingers tightened slightly around his cup. But that sounds dangerously close to resignation. In the camps, I saw people who sat with their suffering, who accepted it as their fate, and they died. They lost the will to live. But there's a crucial difference between acceptance and resignation, the Buddha responds, leaning forward slightly. Resignation is passive, defeated. True acceptance is active, awake. It's seeing clearly what is, without the distortion of what we wish were true. From that clarity comes wisdom, and from wisdom comes right action. The evening light filtering through the cafe windows has shifted, casting longer shadows across their table. The debate is warming up, but there's nothing academic about it. Both men speak from scars, from transformation, from having been broken and reformed by their encounters with suffering. Let me give you an example, the Buddha continues. A man is shot with an arrow. The pain is immediate and real, but then he begins to worry about who shot him, why they shot him, whether he'll die, whether he'll be disfigured, what others will think. He's been shot with a second arrow, the arrow of his mental reaction to the first arrow. Most human suffering is this second arrow. Frankl's eyes sharpen with interest. This resonates with his own observations about meaning and response. That's not far from what I discovered in the camps. We cannot always control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond. But Victor, my friend, I think you're still missing something crucial. Please continue, the Buddha gestures gracefully. Your arrow metaphor assumes the first arrow is inevitable, something to be accepted. But what if we can prevent some of those arrows? What if a doctor can heal the wound, or better yet, what if we can create a world where fewer arrows are shot in the first place? Frankl's passion is building now, the fire that kept him alive in the camps beginning to show. I don't disagree with creating a better world, the Buddha replies calmly. But I've watched civilizations rise and fall for 25 centuries. Every age thinks it can eliminate suffering through external changes, better governments, better medicine, better technology. And yet, the fundamental nature of human suffering remains unchanged, because you're looking at it wrong. Frankl's voice rises slightly, then he catches himself, remembering where they are. A couple at a nearby table glances over, then returns to their own conversation. Forgive me, but this is exactly what I mean. You see suffering as built into the fabric of existence, so you teach people to accept it. I see suffering as often meaningless and preventable, so I teach people to find meaning despite it or to work to eliminate it. The Buddha's expression doesn't change, but there's a subtle shift in the energy between them. The debate is no longer a gentle philosophical exchange. It's becoming personal, urgent, a clash between two fundamentally different ways of understanding human nature itself. Victor, tell me something. In the camps, did you suffer more from the physical pain, the hunger, the cold, the brutality, or from the sense that it was all meaningless? Frankl pauses, caught off guard by the directness of the question. His mind travels back to those dark days, to moments he rarely discusses even in his professional work. The meaninglessness was worse, he admits quietly. The physical pain was terrible, but the sense that it might all be for nothing, that human dignity itself might be an illusion, that nearly destroyed me. And what saved you? Finding meaning, believing that my suffering could serve a purpose, that I could help others, that love transcends even death. Frankl's voice carries the weight of lived truth. The Buddha nods slowly. And where did that meaning come from? Was it something you created or something you discovered? The question hangs in the air between them like a bridge neither wants to cross first. Both men understand that the answer will determine the direction of their entire debate. Frankl stares into his tea for a long moment before responding, and when he looks up, his eyes carry the weight of memory. It came from both, I think, but that's precisely the point. I had to actively create meaning. It didn't just arise from accepting my circumstances. But Viktor, the Buddha's voice remains gentle but probing. Could you have created that meaning if you hadn't first fully experienced the depth of your suffering? If you had spent your energy trying to escape the reality of where you were? The question strikes at something fundamental, and both men feel the tension in the air change. This isn't just philosophy anymore. It's the lived experience of two human beings who have walked through hell and emerged with different maps for the rest of humanity. Frankl runs his hand through his graying hair. I see what you're getting at, but there's a dangerous implication there. You're suggesting that the camps were somehow necessary for my growth, that the murder of millions was justified because some survivors found meaning in it. No, the Buddha responds immediately, his voice carrying a firmness that wasn't there before. I'm not saying suffering is good or necessary. I'm saying it's unavoidable, and that our relationship to it determines whether it destroys us or transforms us. The camps were evil. The death of innocence is tragedy. But your response to that evil, your transformation of that tragedy into wisdom that helps others, that's the difference between being a victim of suffering and being its student. A server refills their cups, the simple domestic act creating a pause in their intense exchange. When she moves away, Frankl speaks more quietly but with no less intensity. But here's what troubles me about your approach. When I work with patients who've survived trauma, who've lost children, who face terminal illness, I don't tell them to find wisdom in their pain. I help them find meaning despite their pain. There's a crucial difference. Is there? The Buddha asks. Or are we talking about the same process using different words? Frankl leans forward, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher who's spent decades in the trenches of human suffering. A woman comes to me after losing her child in an accident. If I tell her to find wisdom in that loss, to accept it as part of some larger pattern, I'm asking her to betray her love for that child. If I help her find ways to honor that love through action, perhaps by working to prevent other accidents, or by helping other grieving parents, then her suffering becomes meaningful without becoming accepted as good. The Buddha considers this carefully. Around them, the cafe has grown quieter as the evening deepens. The few remaining patrons speak in hushed tones, as if sensing the gravity of the conversation at the corner table. Viktor, you're assuming that accepting suffering means calling it good. But what if acceptance simply means seeing it clearly, without the distortion of our wishes and fears? What if wisdom isn't about finding suffering good, but about finding ourselves capable of responding to it, with clarity rather than reactive emotion? But that's exactly what I'm talking about. Frankl's passion flares again. Reactive emotion, anger at injustice, grief at loss, determination to prevent future suffering. These aren't distortions to be transcended. They're the very foundations of meaning and moral action. The Buddha's smile is sad now, tinged with something that might be recognized as the weight of having seen this argument played out across centuries. My friend, I don't ask people to eliminate their emotions. I ask them to understand the difference between feeling anger and being controlled by anger, between experiencing grief and being consumed by grief. And I, Frankl responds, his voice steady but charged, ask them to channel that anger and grief into action that prevents future suffering. You teach people to transcend their circumstances. I teach them to transform their circumstances. The fundamental divide between them is becoming clearer now. Both men have looked into the abyss of human suffering and returned with profound insights, but they've drawn radically different conclusions about what those insights mean for how we should live. Let me ask you something, Frankl continues. In all your centuries of teaching acceptance and transcendence, how much actual suffering have you prevented? How many children have been saved from starvation? How many diseases cured? How many wars prevented? The Buddha's expression doesn't change, but something shifts in his posture. And in all your decades of teaching, meaning-making, and transformation, Viktor, how many of your patients have found lasting peace? How many have escaped the cycle of creating new suffering even as they heal from old wounds? The challenge hangs between them like a sword. Both approaches have their successes and their limitations. Both men have helped countless people, but neither has solved the fundamental problem of human suffering. Outside Vienna continues its quiet evening rhythm, but inside the cafe, two worldviews are grinding against each other like tectonic plates. The friction is creating something new, something neither man expected when they sat down together. Perhaps, Frankl says slowly, we're both right, and both wrong. The Buddha raises an eyebrow, the first clear expression of surprise he's shown all evening. How so? Maybe the question isn't whether suffering leads to wisdom or should be solved. Maybe the question is when to accept and when to act, when to find meaning in suffering and when to work to eliminate it. It's a moment of potential synthesis, but both men understand that the real challenge lies in the details. How do we know when acceptance becomes resignation? How do we know when action becomes mere busy work to avoid facing deeper truths? The debate is far from over. The Buddha sets down his cup, and for the first time this evening, his composure seems to crack slightly. There's something raw in his expression, something deeply human that transcends his role as an enlightened teacher. Victor, let me tell you something I rarely speak of. Before my enlightenment, I had a wife, a child. I left them in the middle of the night to pursue my spiritual quest. For years I told myself this was necessary, that I had to understand suffering before I could help anyone else escape it. Frankl's eyes widen slightly. This isn't the sanitized version of the Buddha's story usually told in temples and textbooks. I caused suffering to pursue the end of suffering. My wife raised our child alone while I sat under trees contemplating the nature of pain. When I finally returned, enlightened and ready to teach, I found that my absence had created its own kind of anguish. The Buddha's voice carries a weight that seems to press down on the entire cafe. So, when you ask me how much suffering my teachings have prevented, I must first acknowledge how much suffering my pursuit of those teachings created. The admission hangs in the air like incense, heavy and transformative. Frankl recognizes the courage it takes to reveal such personal failure, especially for someone whose entire identity is built around having found ultimate truth. Thank you for sharing that, Frankl says quietly. It makes your wisdom more human, more trustworthy somehow. And you, Victor, in your pursuit of meaning, in your work to help others transform their suffering, what wounds have you left unhealed? Frankl's fingers trace the rim of his cup as he considers the question. When he speaks, his voice carries the same raw honesty the Buddha has just demonstrated. I survived the camps, but my first wife didn't. After the war, I remarried, had a daughter, built a career. I threw myself into helping others find meaning in their suffering because I couldn't bear to sit still with my own. I wrote books, gave lectures, developed theories, all while avoiding the simple fact that I felt guilty for surviving when she didn't. The confession seems to surprise even Frankl himself. His hands shake slightly as he lifts his cup. For decades, I helped others find meaning in their pain. While running from the meaninglessness of my own loss, I taught that we can choose our response to any circumstance, but I couldn't choose to forgive myself for being alive when she was dead. The cafe seems smaller now, more intimate. Two men who have spent their lives helping others navigate suffering are finally acknowledging their own unhealed wounds. So perhaps, the Buddha says slowly, our debate isn't really about different approaches to suffering. Perhaps it's about different ways of avoiding our own pain while appearing to address it. Frankl looks up sharply. That's a hell of a thing to say. But is it untrue? The question forces both men into a silence that feels different from their earlier pauses. This isn't the silence of contemplation. It's the silence of recognition, of being seen more clearly than is comfortable. My patients, Frankl continues slowly, they often tell me that finding meaning in their suffering helps them cope. But sometimes I wonder if I'm just giving them a more sophisticated way to avoid feeling their pain fully. And my students, the Buddha responds, they often report feeling more peaceful after learning to accept their circumstances. But sometimes I wonder if I'm teaching them to accept injustice that should be fought against. The recognition of their own limitations creates a strange kind of intimacy between them. These aren't just competing philosophies anymore. They're two flawed human beings who've spent their lives trying to make sense of experiences that might ultimately be senseless. Victor, what if we've both been asking the wrong question? What do you mean? We've been debating whether suffering leads to wisdom or should be solved. But what if suffering simply is? What if it's neither meaningful nor meaningless, neither good nor bad, but simply the inevitable result of being conscious in a universe that doesn't care about our preferences? Frankl considers this, his psychologist's mind turning over the implications. That's almost unbearably bleak, or liberating, the Buddha counters. If suffering has no inherent meaning, then we're free to create whatever meaning serves life, serves love, serves reducing harm. And if suffering is inevitable, then we're free to accept what can't be changed while working to change what can be. But how do we know the difference? How do we know when to accept and when to act? Maybe that's the real wisdom, the Buddha suggests. Not having the right answer, but learning to hold the tension between acceptance and action, between meaning-making and meaning-discovering, between transcendence and transformation. Frankl nods slowly. In the camps, the people who survived weren't just the ones who found meaning or the ones who accepted their circumstances. They were the ones who could do both, who could accept the reality of where they were while maintaining hope that it could change. And in my centuries of teaching, the students who found the deepest peace weren't the ones who perfectly accepted everything or the ones who fought against everything. They were the ones who could sit with uncertainty, who could act from wisdom rather than reactive emotion. A new understanding is emerging between them, born not from victory and debate, but from the vulnerability of shared limitation. Neither man has solved the problem of human suffering, but perhaps that's not the point. Maybe, Frankl suggests, the question isn't whether suffering leads to wisdom or should be solved. Maybe the question is how we learn to dance with it. The Buddha's smile returns, but it's different now, less serene, more alive. A dance requires both leading and following, both structure and improvisation, both acceptance and action, both meaning-making and meaning-discovering. They sit in companionable silence for a moment, two teachers who have just become students again. The evening has deepened around them, and the cafe has grown quieter still. Only a few patrons remain, lost in their own conversations or solitary contemplations. The intimate lighting creates a cocoon around their table, as if the rest of the world has receded to give space for this unlikely meeting of minds. Frankl breaks the contemplative silence first, his voice carrying a new quality, less defensive, more curious. You know, I've spent my entire career fighting against what I saw as passive acceptance of suffering, but listening to you tonight, I'm beginning to wonder if I've been fighting a strawman. How so? When I hear you talk about acceptance, it's not passive at all. It's active engagement with reality as it is, rather than as we wish it were. That takes tremendous courage. The Buddha nods thoughtfully, and when I hear you talk about creating meaning, it's not the desperate grasping I sometimes imagine. It's a form of creativity, of artistic response to circumstances that might otherwise crush the human spirit. But here's what still troubles me, Frankl continues, leaning forward. In my therapeutic work, I see too many people who use acceptance as a way to avoid taking responsibility for changing what can be changed. They come to me paralyzed by depression, trapped in abusive relationships, stuck in meaningless jobs, and they say, I should just accept this as part of life's suffering. Yes, the Buddha agrees readily. I see this too. People use my teachings to justify their own passivity, to avoid the difficult work of discernment. True acceptance requires incredible wisdom to know what truly cannot be changed. And I see people use my emphasis on meaning-making to avoid grieving, to rush past their pain into some kind of productive purpose before they've actually felt what needs to be felt. The admissions create a bridge between their approaches. Both men have seen their teachings misunderstood and misapplied, used as sophisticated forms of avoidance rather than genuine engagement with life's difficulties. Viktor, let me ask you something that's been troubling me for centuries. How do we help people distinguish between suffering that serves growth and suffering that simply destroys? It's a profound question, one that cuts to the heart of both their approaches. Frankl considers it carefully, his mind drawing on decades of clinical experience. I think, he says slowly, it has to do with whether the suffering connects us more deeply to life and others, or isolates us from them. In the camps, I watched people respond to identical circumstances in completely different ways. Some became more compassionate, more aware of what really mattered. Others became bitter, closed off, spiritually dead, even while physically alive. Yes, that resonates deeply. In my own journey, the suffering that led to wisdom was the suffering that broke down my illusions about being separate from others, about being able to control life through my own will. The suffering that was merely destructive was the suffering I endured while clinging to those illusions. So maybe, Frankl suggests, the question isn't whether suffering itself is good or bad, but whether our relationship to it opens us or closes us. But that raises another difficult question, the Buddha responds. How do we help people cultivate a relationship to suffering that opens them without encouraging them to seek out unnecessary pain? It's a question that has haunted both their traditions. Too often, teachings about the value of suffering have been used to justify or romanticize avoidable pain, to encourage people to endure abuse or neglect in the name of spiritual growth. In my practice, Frankl says, I try to help people find meaning in the suffering they can't avoid, while working to eliminate the suffering they can. But the line between the two isn't always clear, and in my teaching, I try to help people see clearly what is actually happening in their experience, without the distortion of wishful thinking or catastrophic interpretation. But clarity alone doesn't tell us what action to take. The conversation has reached a deeper level now, beyond the philosophical positions they started with. They're exploring the lived reality of trying to help people navigate suffering wisely, and both men are discovering how much they have in common despite their apparent differences. Victor, I want to share something with you that I've never said publicly. Sometimes I wonder if my emphasis on acceptance has been too abstract, too removed from the concrete reality of injustice and preventable suffering. Frankl looks surprised. Really? When I see a child dying of hunger while others feast, when I see people oppressed by systems that could be changed, I sometimes think that what the world needs isn't more acceptance of suffering, but more holy anger at unnecessary pain. And I, Frankl admits, sometimes wonder if my emphasis on meaning-making has been too individualistic, too focused on personal transformation, and not enough on collective healing and prevention. The mutual vulnerability creates a new atmosphere between them. These aren't just competing teachers anymore. They're fellow travelers on the difficult path of trying to understand and alleviate human suffering. What if, the Buddha suggests quietly, what if we've been focusing on the wrong question all along? What do you mean? We've been asking whether suffering leads to wisdom or should be solved. But what if the real question is, how do we love people through their suffering, in ways that neither abandon them to their pain, nor rescue them from growth they need to do themselves? The question hangs in the air like a revelation. Both men sit with it, feeling its weight and possibility. That would require, Frankl says slowly, both the wisdom to know when to act and when to be present, and the humility to admit we don't always know the difference. It would require holding paradox, the Buddha agrees, being both accepting and active, both peaceful and passionate, both wise and willing to be wrong. The debate between them is transforming into something neither expected when they sat down together hours ago. The cafe has nearly emptied now, with only the soft murmur of one couple near the window and the gentle clink of dishes being cleaned in the kitchen. The barista has turned down the lights slightly, creating an even more intimate atmosphere around their table. Neither man seems ready to leave. Victor, the Buddha says, his voice carrying a new warmth, I think I've been wrong about something fundamental. Frankl raises his eyebrows, surprised by the directness of the admission. I've spent centuries teaching that attachment leads to suffering, that the goal is to transcend our human bonds. But watching you describe your work, seeing how your love for your patients and your commitment to preventing future suffering drives your meaning-making, I wonder if I've been teaching people to transcend their humanity, rather than to embrace it more fully. The confession seems to cost the Buddha something. His entire teaching tradition is built around the idea of liberation from attachment, and here he is questioning its foundation. But attachment does cause suffering, Frankl responds thoughtfully. My attachment to my first wife made her death agonizing in ways that simple grief wouldn't have been. My attachment to the idea that life should be fair made the camps almost unbearable at first. Yes, but what if the problem isn't attachment itself, but our unconscious attachments, our attachments to outcomes we can't control, to images of ourselves that aren't true, to expectations that life should conform to our preferences? Frankl considers this carefully. So conscious attachment, chosen attachment, love that knows it involves risk but chooses to love anyway. That's different from unconscious clinging? I think it might be. When I left my family to pursue enlightenment, I thought I was transcending attachment, but I was actually attached to the idea of being enlightened, attached to avoiding the messy reality of loving imperfect people in an imperfect world. The Buddha's honesty is creating space for Frankl to examine his own assumptions. And I, Frankl admits, have sometimes encouraged people to find meaning in their suffering, when what they really needed was permission to feel their pain fully without having to make it productive or purposeful. Meaning-making can be its own form of spiritual bypassing, the Buddha agrees, a way to jump over the difficult work of simply being present with what is. But so can acceptance, Frankl counters gently, a way to avoid the difficult work of discerning what can and should be changed. They sit with this recognition for a moment. Both approaches, taken to extremes or applied unconsciously, can become ways of avoiding the full reality of human experience. What if, Frankl suggests, what if both acceptance and meaning-making are skills we need to develop, like muscles that need to be strengthened, and wisdom lies in knowing when to use which one? Or maybe they're not separate skills at all, the Buddha responds. Maybe they're two aspects of the same fundamental capacity, the ability to engage fully with reality as it is while remaining open to reality as it could become. The insight feels significant, like they're approaching something important. Around them, the cafe continues its quiet evening rhythm, but at their table, time seems suspended in possibility. In the camps, Frankl says slowly, the people who survived best weren't just the ones who accepted their circumstances or the ones who found meaning in them. They were the ones who could hold both simultaneously, who could say, this is happening, this is real, this is terrible, and somehow I will find a way to respond that honors both the truth of this moment and the possibility of something beyond it. Yes, the Buddha agrees, his eyes lighting up. And in my own journey, the breakthrough came not when I accepted suffering or transcended it, but when I could hold both the reality of pain and the possibility of freedom without needing to choose between them. It's like holding tension without resolving it prematurely, like learning to live in the questions rather than rushing to answers that don't actually fit the complexity of real experience. A new understanding is crystallizing between them, something that transcends their original debate. They're not discovering that one approach is right and the other wrong, but that both approaches are partial truths that need each other to become whole. Victor, what if our students and patients need both of us? What if some people at certain times in their lives need to learn acceptance and presence with suffering, while others at other times need to learn to create meaning and take action? And what if the same person needs both, even in the same moment? What if wisdom isn't about choosing between acceptance and action, but about learning to dance with both? The metaphor of dance returns, and both men smile at its aptness. A dance requires both partners to be fully present and responsive to each other, neither leading nor following exclusively, but moving together in response to music they're creating as they go. So maybe, Frankl suggests, instead of debating whether suffering leads to wisdom or should be solved, we should be asking, how do we help people develop the capacity to engage with their suffering in ways that are both deeply accepting and actively transformative? How do we teach people to love themselves and others through pain in ways that honor both the reality of what is and the possibility of what could be? The questions feel alive, generative, full of potential for new approaches to human healing and growth. I think, the Buddha says quietly, we might be onto something revolutionary here. Frankl nods, his eyes bright with possibility. What if we've just discovered that the ancient path and the modern path aren't opposites, but dance partners? The synthesis feels complete, but both men sense there's still something more to explore. The clock on the cafe wall shows well past midnight, but neither man seems aware of the time. The barista has given up any pretense of cleaning and sits reading behind the counter, occasionally glancing over at the two figures still deep in conversation. Something about their presence has transformed the space, made it feel less like a commercial establishment and more like a sanctuary for deep dialogue. Victor, the Buddha says, his voice carrying both exhaustion and exhilaration, I think we need to be very careful about what we do with this insight we've discovered together. How so? Ideas can become dogma so quickly. People will want to turn what we've explored tonight into a system, a method, a new technique for dealing with suffering. But what we found isn't a technique. It's a way of being, a quality of engagement with life itself. Frankl nods thoughtfully. Yes, I see that danger. In my own work, I've watched people turn logotherapy into just another form of positive thinking, missing the deeper challenge of actually sitting with meaninglessness long enough to create something authentic. And I've watched people turn mindfulness into spiritual materialism, collecting enlightenment experiences like trophies, while avoiding the humbling work of actually changing how they treat others. The concern they share is real and important. Both men have seen their teachings misunderstood, reduced to techniques for feeling better, rather than invitations to engage more fully with the complexity of being human. So how do we share what we've discovered without destroying it in the sharing? Frankl asks. The Buddha considers this for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. Maybe we start by admitting that we don't have all the answers. Maybe we share our questions rather than our conclusions. And maybe we model the integration rather than just talking about it. Show people what it looks like to hold both acceptance and action, both presence and purpose. But that's the hardest thing of all, the Buddha admits. It would require us to be vulnerable about our own ongoing struggles, to teach from our wounds rather than from our supposed wisdom, to be authentic rather than authoritative. The implications of what they're discussing are staggering. Both men have built their reputations on having found answers to life's deepest questions. To acknowledge publicly that their answers are partial, that they're still learning, that they need each other's perspectives to see clearly, this would require a level of humility that few teachers ever achieve. Viktor, what if the real teaching isn't about suffering at all? What if it's about how to remain open-hearted in a world that breaks hearts regularly? The question reframes everything they've been discussing. Instead of focusing on suffering as the central human experience, it points to love and openness as the real challenges and opportunities of being human. That changes everything, Frankl responds slowly. If the goal isn't to transcend suffering or find meaning in it, but simply to keep loving despite it, that requires both acceptance and action, both presence and purpose. And it makes suffering neither the enemy to be defeated nor the teacher to be revered, but simply the context in which love gets tested and strengthened. Around them, the cafe seems to pulse with the significance of this insight. Love as the central fact, suffering as the context, wisdom as the capacity to keep loving no matter what. But how do we help people develop that capacity? Frankl wonders aloud. How do we teach open-heartedness in a world that seems designed to close hearts? Maybe, the Buddha suggests, by creating spaces like this one, where people can be real about their struggles without having to fix them immediately, where they can be seen in their pain without being rushed toward healing, where they can discover that their suffering doesn't make them broken, but makes them human, and their humanity doesn't make them weak, but makes them capable of connection. The conversation has come full circle, but at a deeper level. They started by debating different approaches to suffering and discovered that the real question is how to love through suffering. They started as opponents and found themselves as collaborators in the ancient human project of learning to live wisely. Viktor, I have a confession to make. When I first heard about your work, I was skeptical. I thought you were just teaching people to make the best of bad situations without addressing the deeper causes of suffering. And I thought you were teaching people to be passive in the face of injustice, to accept what should be fought against. But we were both seeing caricatures of each other's work, weren't we? Missing the depth and complexity of approaches we hadn't taken time to understand. Yes, and maybe that's another teaching. That understanding requires genuine dialogue, not just debate. It requires being willing to be changed by the encounter. The Buddha smiles, and for the first time all evening, he looks tired. Not depleted, but like someone who has done important work and is ready to rest. Viktor, what do you think would happen if we actually tried to integrate our approaches? If we created spaces for healing that honored both the need for acceptance and the call to action? I think, Frankl responds slowly, we might discover that healing is less about fixing problems and more about developing the capacity to engage with life fully, regardless of circumstances. And that wisdom is less about having the right answers and more about learning to live well within the questions. They sit in comfortable silence for a moment, two men who began the evening as philosophical opponents and are ending it as unlikely allies in the ancient human quest for meaning and peace. I suppose we should let this good man close his cafe, the Buddha says, gesturing toward the patient barista. Yes, but Viktor, this conversation doesn't end here, does it? No, Frankl agrees, standing and extending his hand. I think this is just the beginning. As they shake hands, both men understand that they've participated in something rare and precious, a genuine meeting of minds and hearts across vast differences of time, culture, and approach. They've demonstrated that even the deepest philosophical disagreements can become doorways to greater understanding when approached with humility and genuine curiosity. Outside, Vienna sleeps under ancient stars, unaware that in a small cafe, Two of humanity's greatest teachers have just discovered that their wisdom is not in their answers, but in their willingness to keep questioning together. The debate is over. The dialogue has just begun.